So I'm very pleased to welcome Johanna Stirling as this afternoon's presenter. Johanna has been teaching for over 25 years and is now an Associate Trainer at the Norwich Institute for Language Education, or NILE, as well as the NILE Online Academic Manager. Johanna is also a materials writer and has authored components of a range of Cambridge courses including Face-to-Face, English Unlimited and Unlock, as well as the self-published Teaching Spelling to English Language Learners. She has given many presentations and training sessions for Cambridge University Press. So over to you, Johanna.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Simon. Hello, everybody. I've been watching where you're all from. I think we've got just about the whole of the world covered, haven't we? That's fantastic to see. So thank you, and thank you very much for to Cambridge English for inviting me back. Right. So today we're going to be looking at feedback and how we can make feedback really effective to help students move forward and onto a higher level of English. All right. First, I want to just check that we all have the same kind of idea what we mean by feedback, and we're going to look at three different types of feedback. And the first one is this. Okay, if you can imagine what that is. Okay, this is the kind of feedback that we do after our students have done an activity in class, and the teacher gets feedback from them on their answers. Okay, so the learners to the teachers. That's right, Simona. L is for student, and T is obviously for teacher. Okay, so there's that kind of feedback. Then there's also, and I suppose this is the main part of the presentation, there's also the type of feedback to the learner. Okay, and I've put here T, P, and S. Would you like to write in the chat? What do you think? Who gives feedback to the learner? What do you think T, P, and S stand for? Okay, I think the first person to get all three right, as far as I can see, is Alexei. That's right, we're talking about teacher, peer, and self. Okay, and we'll come back to that later, but different ways of giving feedback to learners. Now there's another type as well, and it's this. Okay, I don't know if you all know, but there's the word feedback in English also means that horrible noise that you get when somebody moves a microphone too near to a speaker. You know, if you're at a concert or something, sometimes you get it. Horrible noise. And exactly, Karen. So this is another type of feedback, and this is just the horrible noise type of feedback. And let's get that out of the way first. For me, it's when, for example, the teacher overcorrects. Yeah, it's great to do some correction, but when students are corrected every time they make any mistake, to me, that's the kind of feedback that's a horrible noise, because it doesn't actually help them, and it can actually have quite a negative effect. Yes, Adele, it can be very demotivating. I was traveling overseas, and I was going to do a presentation somewhere, and a young student, I suppose he was about 11 or 12 years old, had been asked to help me with the technology. That's who the technicians are often in schools now, the kids. And while he was helping me, he was telling me all about his town and about the history of the town, and it was great. And he said, and he was talking about a building, and he said, and it has been built 300 years ago or something. And his teacher walked in at that time and said, not has been, but was. And what do you think the little boy did? Any ideas? Exactly, Annette. He stopped talking. He didn't say anything else. And that, to me, is the kind of feedback that we don't know. The teacher might have had a good reason for doing it, but the effect that it had on the student was he stopped talking, and his talking had been great before that. And I was really enjoying it and enjoying the communication. And it's the same with writing. If we're constantly correcting everything, we have to ask ourselves whether it's the most useful thing. So let's stop looking at that kind of horrible feedback and move on to the kind of feedback that we actually give students. Okay, I don't know if any of you have heard of John Hattie. If you haven't, I really recommend that you Google him or get his book. Not at the moment, please stay with me for a while. His book is called Visible Learning, and he's got another one called Visible Learning for Teachers. And in there, he looks at these enormous meta studies of research that have been done about language learning and language teaching. So instead of just looking at one or two bits of research, I can't remember what it is. It's something, I don't know, about 1,000 pieces of research or something. And so I think it gives us a really clear picture of what works in teaching and what doesn't. And he says that feedback comes out again and again as one of the top 10 influences on student achievement. Okay, so if learners get good feedback, and when I say good feedback, I don't mean always positive, but if they get helpful feedback, then their achievement is higher. Now, one thing I should mention is that his research comes from mainstream education, not necessarily English language teaching. But I think we can easily transfer it to English language teaching. The principles are the same. But the other thing that clearly comes out of his research is that it's a very complex area. Okay, so let's take a look at that. For example, one thing he says is that it's not really about quantity. The quantity is not so important, except that there mustn't be too much feedback. Because I'm sure you can imagine why. If there's too much feedback, then what do you think happens? Just write in the chat. What do you think happens if there's too much feedback? You see, I'm going to make you work. You can't just sit and listen. Okay, a mess, confusion. It's ignored. Emma, that's what I'd say. Yeah, and afraid to make mistakes. Demotivation. Overloaded. Yeah, exactly. Joanne says they don't bother reading it. Okay, yeah. So when we give too much, then people can't process it. So it's much better to give a smaller amount of feedback, but really good quality feedback. And so I think this is where our skill as teachers really comes in, because it's not only that we have to think how much feedback and what's the good type of feedback to give, but we also have to recognize that different students receive feedback in different ways. Okay, and then the next really important skill that we have to use is for the teacher to know how to use the feedback that they get from students. So our feedback to them needs to be based on what students really know, not just on what we think they know. Emilia says it's hard for the teacher, and it is hard, and that's why we're a profession. It's not just a job. This is a profession, and we have to use all of our skill. Okay, so let's start then by looking at feedback from students to the teacher. So you give your students an exercise, maybe you get them to check in pairs, something like that. And then that information that we found, then that enables us to give the learners feedback. Not necessarily ourselves, it could be self-feedback or peer feedback, but that's what informs it. And the very important thing about the feedback that we give to learners is that it has impact. Okay, and this means, for example, that the students really engage with it. Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with this situation. Your students give you some writing, for example. You stay up very late at night marking all their writing. Okay, you spend a lot of time doing that. You're correcting them, you're trying to help them, and you also have to put a grade on it. When your students get the work back, what do they look at? They look at the grade, and what do they do with the rest? Well, we'd like to think that we'd like to think that they then look carefully at all our comments, but very often, as Daniela says, they file it away. Okay, and they don't really look. So all the work that we do, you're all saying the same thing. Yeah, they do tend to ignore that. Not everybody, of course. You've got some really good students who do process that, but it's very easy for them to just put it away. Then, so we need to engage them with it, and then that's quite interesting. Rula says it's different with adult learners. Some, I would say, some adult learners, and of course there are some who are conscientious. Okay, then we need our students to interpret our comments so they know what to do, and then the all-important part is that they can apply it. So let's have a look at some of this. So really, when we're teaching, there are 3 questions that learners need to be able to answer for themselves, and they're these 3 questions. Where am I going? So what's my destination? How am I going there? So how am I going to get to my destination? Okay, what steps do I need to take? And am I going in the right direction? Or have I got lost? And then where am I going next? All right, so it's a little bit like a Google map. All right, so first let's have a look at where am I going. In order for people to know where they're going, they need to know the objectives of what they're doing. And I'm going to show you some examples today. All of the examples I'm showing you come from the Cambridge English Empower course book. I don't know, maybe some of you know it. This is from the B1 Plus book, and they're all from the same unit. Anyway, at the beginning of the unit, you can see these can-do objectives. Okay, I don't know if it's a bit small, so I'll read them. Describe people and their abilities, describe feelings, offer and ask for help, write an informal online advert. Okay, so they know the things that they should be able to do by the end of the unit. And then they go to the first lesson. Remember, the first thing was describe people and their abilities. So at the beginning of the first lesson, they have these objectives in the green box. Okay, learn to describe people and their abilities, and this is broken down into modals and phrases of ability and vocabulary about ability. So there we're more specific. And then in the teacher's book for that same lesson, the objectives are more detailed. Because these are for the teacher needs to be really clear about what the students are aiming to do, so that the teacher can see what the gap is between what the learners can do and these aims. So I'll just let you read those for a minute. Okay, so very important to have clear aims. Okay, so and then we go on to how am I going there? So I don't know, is this big enough for you to read or not? I'm just thinking if some of you are on mobiles, it might be a bit small. Okay, everybody's saying yes at the moment. Great. All right. If you take a look at that, then this is also from Empower. And I want you to notice here how learners work towards those aims. This is about the vocabulary of ability, step by step. So first, A and B is personalized. Okay, so they try to use the language they've already got, talking about what they're good at. Then they have some reading. You can't see the reading. Actually, it's on another page. Okay, and they're reading for general information. And then they read the article and they're choosing the best words, and these are all to do with ability. Again, you can't see that. And then in E, you can see they're identifying these words, they're identifying what their meanings are, so they're grouping them. And categorizing is a higher order thinking skill, a useful thing for them to do. And then in F, if you look at that, is working on the prepositions, because it's no good students knowing these. If they want to use them, they have to know the prepositions as well. And then finally, they come back to do more personalized work, and they're actually using that in sentences and talking. So it's going very much step by step. It's teaching and not just testing, in other words. Okay. So let's just have a look at some ways that teachers can get feedback from learners. Okay. So here's an activity. This is from the beginning of the unit. Okay, I don't think you can read it this time. That's not very clear, but it doesn't matter actually. The students have just got to talk about these two children and what they think the difference in their personality is, and it's questions like that. Okay, why children have different, even if they're from the same family, they might have different personalities. So this is a chance for the students to just try to speak. Okay, so a question for you. How much feedback would you give your students while they were doing that speaking at the beginning of the unit? Okay, just type your answers in the box. Okay. Okay, Charlotte says it depends on how much they have to say. Yeah, so you might need to prompt them a bit. But okay, great. So you're mostly saying what I think as well, which is probably no feedback or only a little feedback. Because the reason we're doing that is to get them interested in the subject, and it also is diagnostic for us. We can see how much they can already talk about ability and personality. Okay, so if there's a communication breakdown, as Amelia says here, she would support them but not correct them. Yes, if there's a communication breakdown, then you may need to help. So you're in a supportive role. And the other thing that the teacher needs to do is to note down any problems with the target language. Okay, but at this stage, we don't really need to correct. And it might be a bit damaging to do so. Okay, let's go back to the page we looked at before, and let's have a look at this. And what I'd like you to do is, thinking about these different activities, how would you get feedback from your students to the whole class? Okay, so let's say for each activity here, the students have already compared with their partner or done the speaking, and you want to get feedback from the whole class. You could just stand at the front and say, okay, what's the answer to number 1? People shout out the answers. Okay, but can you think of some different ways of getting feedback? Could you put those in the chat for me, please? I'll just give you a few minutes to do that. Any different ways of getting feedback from the students to the whole class? And it could be for any of these activities. We're talking quite generally. Okay. All right, we've got some ideas coming now. Okay. Okay, if you're not writing, perhaps you could read what's in the quiz. Those going in the chat box. It's going quite quickly though. Okay, remember what we need is how they are sharing their answers with the whole class. Okay, there's some interesting ideas there. Okay. All right, great. Okay, Leah, that's a nice idea. Get a student to get in the shoes of a teacher. Okay, a summary of similarities and differences from Karen. Okay, remember it's how they share with the whole class. Okay. All right. Okay. What I'm going to do, I haven't got time to go through all of those, is let's look at some ideas of mine, and you might find some of them are the same as yours. Okay. So the first one I've got here is the use of mini whiteboards. I don't know whether any of you use these. In some ways, they're quite old-fashioned, but in other ways, I find they're being used a lot in schools now. We use them here at Nile. We use them a lot. Okay, and if you haven't seen these are just exactly what they say, a little whiteboard. It's about the size of a piece of paper. And students have a pen and they can write on it and then they can rub their answers off. If you haven't got any and can't get them, one way is to make them yourself if you have a laminator. You just take a piece of paper and you laminate it, and the students have a pen and a piece of paper piece of tissue paper or something to wipe it with. The big advantage of these is you ask a question to the whole class and everybody writes the answer and holds it up. And this keeps everybody engaged in the feedback. And also you can quickly look around and see how well the class generally is doing. Okay, so I think those are great. I don't know if any of you already use them. Another idea is lollipop sticks. Okay, those little wooden sticks that you get in lollipops or ice creams. Charlotte, yes, you can do it digitally with Socrative, and there are other apps as well that you can use. Okay, lollipop sticks. These are the little wooden sticks you get in ice creams, and a lot of research has shown that if you ask your students a question and you ask them to put up their hand if they've got the answer, which is a more controlled way of asking, of course, than everybody shouting out, research shows that it's very often the same people who put up their hands, and so the same people who get to answer. If you want to make it more even, you get the lollipop sticks and you write each student's name on a lollipop stick. Okay? And then you put the sticks in a pot, and when you ask a question, you pull out one lollipop stick and you ask the person whose name is on the stick, you ask them to answer. Okay? And then you don't put that back in the pot. You put it on the table. And in that way, everybody in the class gets a chance to answer. And it's not always the same people. And that keeps everybody on their toes. They never know when they're going to be asked. Okay, now, some people might say that's a bit stressful, but I think it's a good kind of stress. Okay? And if you've got a difficult question and you've just chosen the weakest student, you could always cheat a bit. And you might be able to swap them around. Ariane, a great idea. In a mixed ability class, you can color code them. Excellent. Difficult questions to green students, for example. I love that idea. Right, I'm going to do that. Thank you very much. I love doing these webinars because I always learn something. Okay. The next one is asking across the class. I really like doing this. So let's say it could just be a grammar exercise or something. So I might say to somebody, right, Maria, what do you think about question A? And Maria says, I think the answer to question A is false. Okay? And then she doesn't tell me, she tells the rest of the class, and then she nominates another student. She might say, Anjay, do you agree with me? And Anjay says whether he does or doesn't. And if not, they might turn to me and say, we don't know, which is it? But the teacher only intervenes either when somebody asks or when something is clearly wrong and they've all accepted the wrong answer. Okay, so it becomes much more, somebody said something earlier about autonomy, and that really helps them to be autonomous. Not everything has to go through the teacher, sorry. And then I think that helps them outside class as well. Okay. Another idea, and somebody mentioned this, is getting perhaps a learner who finishes quickly, to come to the board, and they write their answers and the others say whether they agree or not. And again, the teacher intervenes if there's a problem there. Or one learner comes up and acts as teacher. Something else I do, especially if we've got something that's true or false, is I get the learners to stick out their arm And if they think the answer is true, they put their thumbs up. If it's false, they put their thumbs down. Now, I know in some cultures this is not acceptable. It's a rude thing to do. If it is in yours, obviously don't do it. But in other parts of the world, it's no problem. Or you could use coloured cards. So they have different colour cards and they have to show the answer with those. And one last way is for the teacher to put up the answers on the whiteboard or on the projector, whatever, but one of them is wrong and they have to say which one is wrong. Now, I wouldn't do this with every class. Some classes, especially if they're weak, or you've got some people who are weak or who have learning differences, it might not work because they go away with the wrong answer. But if you've got a class who are quite switched on, they often really like doing that, finding the teacher's mistake. Okay, all right. So, as I say, what we need to do is identify the gap between the objectives and what the students can really do, which we've seen from their feedback, and then find an impactful way to give them feedback. Okay, I've got some more questions here. Okay, and you might recognize those from the poll. Could we, Charlotte, could we have the poll back, please? And if we display the answers. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I asked you about these same questions beforehand. So let's have a look at what you said. So formative feedback is usually more effective for learning than summative feedback. Now, if you're not sure what these are, formative and summative, I'll explain in a second. But interestingly, it's changing all the time. Okay, the people who hadn't done it before. But over 60% of people agreed with that. Feedback from the teacher usually has a better effect on learning than from peers or self-feedback. Only about a third of people agreed with that. So 2/3 didn't. It's usually more helpful to focus on what's right than what's wrong. Okay, and only just over a third of people agreed with that. More people thought it's more helpful to focus on what's wrong. We'll look at what research says in a few minutes. Feedback works best when it focuses on the learner's overall ability rather than their performance in one activity. And what have we got here? Oh, it's coming on, it's changing. It's coming on for nearly half and half, okay? But more people seem to think it's more effective to focus on their ability in one activity. And the last one, immediate feedback is usually better than delayed feedback. And well over 50% of people think that's true. Brilliant, thank you. So we're going to look at these in more detail. So if we could move that poll, that's brilliant, thank you. Okay. So formative or summative? Let's just have a look at what we mean by those. So formative feedback is where the students do some work, we look at their work, we get feedback from them. This informs us about about how well they're doing. Okay, that tells us what we need to do next, and then we give more tasks. And so it's like this circle. So we're just helping them to get better. For example, if I wanted to use some formative assessment with you now, I could ask you what we've done. I could ask you some questions about what we've done in this webinar so far, and I could see where you're having problems, anything you haven't understood, and I could go back perhaps and present that in a different way. That would be formative feedback. Okay, so supporting the learners to improve. And the other type of feedback is summative. And this is where we say we might give them a grade, or we might praise them. We say, yes, that's good, and that's the right answer. Okay, so in this webinar, perhaps instead of, I could give you a task again, but instead of that then informing my teaching, it's just giving you a grade. You've got the grade, so you know how well you did, or I know how well you did. Okay, and that's kind of the end. Okay. So yeah, very often this is done with some kind of grade. And I would also argue that in some ways praise is formative feedback. You're saying, yes, that's good. Okay, and then you're moving on. You're not necessarily helping them to learn more. I'm not saying praise is a bad idea, but we'll come to that a bit more. Anyway, from the research that I've looked at, it seems that formative feedback has the greatest impact on learning, which probably isn't surprising for you, but only if the teacher is using information that they've learned from the students about how well they're managing with the content. Okay, so we must have that feedback from learners first to see how they're coping with the work, and then we can give them help to improve. But summative feedback, where we grade them, as we said before, they only tend to focus on the grade. Okay, so what can we do? What I think one of the things we need to do is shift our teaching more from summative to formative. Sometimes we have to do formative assessment, tests, exams have to be done sometimes. But wherever possible, where we have the choice, I feel we need summative feedback, because that's what really helps students. So let's take the example of writing. And I'll just tell you one way that I deal with this. I ask all my learners to keep their writing assignments in a folder, and when they've done a piece of writing, I don't correct everything. In fact, I don't correct that much. I usually ask myself whether before my pen hits the paper, I usually ask myself whether that's going to help them or not. Take, for example, the third person S in the present simple. Okay, do your students leave that S off? I'm sure they do. Okay, because all of mine do. And yeah, and I spent years going through writing all these S's on, and then suddenly I thought, why do I do this? Am I doing this for them or for me? And I think, I'd get annoyed doing it. Why don't they write the S's? Now I don't do that. I would write on the bottom, in your next assignment, check that your verbs agree with the subjects. Okay, and I leave them to do it. Okay, but it also, the things that I actually write on their text are things that'll help them. Maybe I see something that they've written and I know what they mean, but they haven't expressed it well, and they need that language, and so I give them that language because that's what they need. And I find that much more useful than going through and writing S's all over everything. I also, in your next assignment, try to use a wider variety of adjectives or something like that. So something that will help them. And then they keep everything in the folder. They have a checklist of what I've told them they need to check. And then I can just quickly look back and see whether they have in fact done those things. Okay. Remember, keep your questions coming, put them in the chat. I'm not going to stop to answer them at the moment, but I will at the end. Okay, sometimes we do need to do tests because learners need to know where they are and we need to know where they are. And a lot of course books have tests built into them. In Empower, for example, you've got end of unit tests and also mid-course and end of course tests. Now, although they can get grades from these have also been made into summative assessment as well. And what happens here, oh, by the way, it's also very important that these tests are valid, that they're really going to test what they're supposed to be tested. The nice thing about the ones in Empower is that they've all been checked by people from Cambridge Assessment, and so we know that they're really good tests. Okay, but what happens in those tests is that after they've done it, they get the score, and then they're told what to do next. So it could be that they then watch a presentation about that grammar again because they've obviously not got the right idea, and then do some extra exercises so they get more practice. Or it could be that they've done very well, and so they're given something at a higher level. So they're pushed to do something a bit higher. Okay. They also have, after they've done that, they get the chance to try again. Okay. Looking at who feeds back, we looked at it could be the teacher, it could be peer, it could be self. And again, looking at the research, what came out as most useful was actually self-assessment, self-feedback. That's in theory, but I think in my experience, it's not always that easy to do. What I've found is that most students want feedback from the teacher. Would you agree? Is it true with your students? Yeah, I mean, it might not be what we think is best, but it's often what their expectations are. Okay. So with peer and self feedback and assessment, I think we have to really train them to do that. And somebody says some are really touchy. I think that's a really good point. You know, if you don't train them to give each other feedback, they might actually come over as a bit rude and upset somebody, or they might, I find very often they just say, yes, it's very good. And, you know, they're not confident enough to correct each other. So let's have a look at a way that we can really train students to give themselves feedback and give other people. I know this isn't terribly easy to read, but what you've got here is an exercise on articles. Okay, you don't need to read that. They do that exercise, then they complete the rules, and then they can check in the grammar. But what I want you to look at is D and E. Okay, so in D, they have to write a short article about one of the topics, and notice this next bit, try to use articles correctly. So they're only writing a short paragraph, but they're really focusing themselves on the use of articles. So they're kind of assessing themselves. They've got that focus. And then the final one, E, read and check your partner's paragraphs. Are there any mistakes with articles? So the partner who's reading can refer back to the rules above, okay, and to the grammar focus at the back of the book. And then it's really helping them step by step. Okay. And best with really short tasks as well. And I also find it's best where the peer feedback is objective. Where they have to give an opinion, that's where it can sometimes become a bit tricky. I just noticed Julie said, what about other skills? I think when I'm training students to give peer and self feedback, then I quite like to start with something like this. And later you can build up to skills work, because I think I think giving feedback on writing and speaking is more difficult. Okay, my next question is, do we focus on what's right or what's wrong? Now, I sometimes think we don't focus enough on what's right. I think when we, especially when we're marking things like grammar exercises, I think we tend to focus on the ones that are wrong. And yeah, and it's really important that we do that because they need encouragement. Okay, and also they need to take away the right answers. However, research shows, and again I'm going back to John Hattie and also another researcher who some of you might know, called I can't remember his first name. I think it's David Williams. And yeah, and he says that disconfirmation is more powerful for learning than confirmation. So when you tell learners what's wrong, then you help them more than when you tell them what's right. But I'd like you to remember that this is about all kinds of education. And a lot of education is also based around knowledge, whereas language learning is a skill. So I think we really have to balance this. But we have to let our students make errors sometimes so that we can correct those. Another question that this throws up is, how do we correct wrong answers? How do we respond to wrong answers? Do you, with your students, if they give the wrong answer, do you ever say no to them? Or do you do something else? Okay, some of you just frown or something. Yeah, I do. I say no to my students. I say it in a nice way. I say it with a smile, or, you know, a hand gesture to show no, not quite. But I think sometimes we just have to say no, but in a nice way. Something I want to show you that primary teachers in England often use is something called 3 stars and a wish. Actually, in this picture, we've got more than 3 stars. Sometimes they do 2 stars. So teachers often write, 2 or 3 things that they like, and something they wish. Something they wish was better. Okay. Okay. And with listening, for example, when we're doing the feedback from that, sometimes it's really good to focus on the wrong answers and think, why did they make that wrong answer? And to go back and think, well, what did they hear? Or why was that wrong? And see if we can help them. And the last thing I want to look at is whether we feedback on the product, which is the task, what they've done in the task, or on the person. And we could talk about task involving feedback. So we tell students what they need to do to improve on that particular task, or ego involving, and this is focusing on them. So you could say, you're the best speaker in the class, or you're really good at this, or maybe you don't try hard enough, or you can't do this. And the effect of this is the task involving makes them think, whereas the ego involving very often makes them have an emotional response. And that can be dangerous. Even the good ones, even you say to somebody, you're the best, then they've got a long way to fall. They might not take risks because they want to stay the best. Okay? If you're good, if you say they're good at something, again, might have the same problem. But you don't try hard enough, might make them feel quite disengaged, and certainly telling them that they can't. So we need to minimize emotional responses and maximize thinking. Okay, I'm going to skip through that one because it's complicated. So most important, I think, are these three words. I think feedback needs to be kind, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be helpful. Okay, we need to show students that maybe they need to do something again. They need to recycle it if you want. They need to try something more advanced, or they need to go on to do something else. And we call this learning-oriented assessment, okay, where the assessment tells us what is needed next. And this could just be informal, in class. We get feedback from the learners, and then we show them how to improve. Or it could be more formal, structured testing, but we use what we've learnt to help them. Okay, I'm going to miss that. Okay, I realise that I've overrun slightly. I'm sorry about that. But I'm very happy to answer any questions. There are my contact details there if you want to contact me. Okay.
Great, thank you very much there, Johanna. Thanks a lot. I think everyone will agree that was a really lovely webinar. So please post your questions in there. We have a few already which I can read out. But if you're thinking of any further questions here, I'll just try and summarise what I got from that. So we started off by saying don't correct everything. It's demotivating. Helpful feedback basically helps higher achievement, and small amounts of feedback and better quality feedback is better. And teachers can get feedback from learners in many different ways, for example via speaking exercises, and that's kind of a diagnostic way for teachers to hear what the problems the students are having. We looked at formative versus summative, and really the teacher needs to think, will my specific feedback actually help the student? Is it worth giving, and how do I give that? Are there different ways to actually give the student or students feedback? And in summary, be kind with the feedback, be specific, and I suppose that culminates in it all being helpful. And learner-oriented assessment as well, which is the feedback which gives us the knowledge to help the students. So let's just have a look at, I hope you'll find that's a fair summary there, Johanna. I don't know.
Yeah, excellent. I could have done it in a minute like you.
So let's just have a look at down some of the questions that we've got here. There's a couple of people, like Jose here, has asked how much time should feedback take? I suppose if we probably think in terms of a lesson, how is that divided up?
I think it's a really useful question and an interesting one, because in some ways it takes as long as it takes. You might know the expression, how long is a piece of string? But I think what we have to do is recognise when feedback is really going to help and when it's not. So we don't want to spend ages on something. If we can see quite quickly that everybody's got it, then we can move on to something else, and we don't want to spend a lot of time. But sometimes I think it's a really valuable part of the learning experience, and they might, having had a go at an exercise, they might be more receptive to the feedback sort of as clarification or as presentation than they would be when you're just telling them. So I think it really depends, but sometimes I think maybe we don't give enough time to it. But I couldn't give a percentage.
Sure. One point that came up about it's when the students are correcting their own work. I think it's, why don't you give them a second opportunity to improve the first version
Oh
of
yeah.
the assignment, won't they learn more that way? That was from
Mm.
David.
I think absolutely. But the problem is, I think absolutely in theory, and with some students that works really well, and I think it's terribly important. What I'm always very careful about, though, is um, thinking about the difference between theory and reality. And in the reality, and a lot of my work has been with adults. I notice a lot of you are saying, "Is this true for adults?" A lot of my work's been with adults, so yes. And I've very often found that they don't do it, and I spend a lot of time nagging them to do the second draft, and they don't want to do it. Now, if I've got a very motivated class and they do, it's fantastic. But so ideally, yes, but they often hate doing it. I find it easier if the work is word processed because then it's easier for them to correct, and I usually get them to make the corrections in a different colour, and then they're much more likely to do it. So yes, certainly in theory, but I know there are problems in practice.
Sure, sure. Uh, Julie Day's written here, this is all very grammar focused. What about with other skills?
Okay, yeah, I think I partly answered that during, maybe she meant for the whole thing. Yes, I think we've talked about writing. With speaking, I think generally I would wait until the end. We didn't really have time to deal with immediate and delayed, but I'd wait until the end, and then some general feedback to everybody on what they've done, and reading and listening. As I said, we can a bit more focus on why learners have got things wrong, I think, and then that helps to inform us.
I was just thinking at the beginning, I remember we actually said don't correct everything, but I think when I started teaching, I did the opposite. I was sort of too polite to correct people. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's striking a balance as well between the two, and
Definitely.
gauging the individual if they're going to take it criticism well. And I think it takes a bit of time for that. But
Mm.
yeah, I don't think I corrected enough at the start, and the students
Yeah.
were saying, well, can you help me? Can you tell me if if I got that right or wrong? But yeah, I suppose it's all about that was in the early days of teaching. As you
Mm.
say, it's an art form, it's a skill. It's
It
something
is,
that
and I think that's the really important thing, actually, because I don't think there are black and white answers to any of this, and it's what we trained for, and it's and what our experience tells us, and why we're so great.
I think we'll end on that. Thank you very much, because I don't think I think we're sort of run out of questions there. But yeah, I think that's all we got time for. Thanks again, Joanna, for that
Very
webinar.
welcome anytime.
So to everyone else, thank you as well for attending. Don't forget to check our events page for details of our up and coming webinars, which you can visit. Charlotte will put the web link up now, which is cambridge.org/ELT events. And the recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and YouTube channel next week. And please, again, don't forget to download your certificates from the link on the screen, which again will be put up in a couple of seconds, as we won't be sending certificates out by email, I'm afraid. So that's all we've got time for. Thanks again for attending, and thanks again to Joanna.